Hello, Claremont. Welcome to yet another episode of Claremont Speaks. Tonight we've got a guest on. He's been on before. He's back again. Evaggelos Vallianatos has been on before talking about not only the environmental approach Claremont's taking, right? And then later the Antikythera mechanism. Tonight, we're going to draw on Ev's experience, opinions, insight into the EPA. We're going to focus on food and pesticides and things like that. Welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So for the purposes of refreshing everybody's memory, or if you haven't listened to the other episodes yet, Ev, why don't we do this to start? Give a little introduction to yourself and talk about your experience with the EPA and how they steered you towards agriculture, pesticides, and crops. You came to this country, you went to school, and then what happened?
Okay. Well, I arrived in the United States in 1961. I started at the University of Illinois almost right away at the University of Illinois in Chicago. And then I went to Champaign-Urbana where I got 2 degrees, a BA in zoology and a master's in Greek medieval history.
And Champaign-Urbana
Illinois,
is right in the middle of as much corn as you can grow anywhere, right?
Exactly.
My friends who went there, they said it's endless. They said you get lost out there.
Yeah, it's an agricultural school primarily, but they have great departments in the humanities and so on. So I enjoyed my time at the University of Illinois. I studied zoology because I was thinking of becoming a medical doctor. So I worked for a medical doctor in Chicago for a while, and I decided that was not for me. So I changed, and I left Illinois, and I went to the University of Wisconsin, where I got a doctor's degree, a PhD in Greek and European history. And that led me to doing my postdoctoral at Harvard, where I focused on the history of science. And that became my ticket to Washington, D.C., pretty much. And I started on Capitol Hill. I spent 2 years on Capitol Hill assisting in a department, they used to call it Congressional Office of Technology Assessment, where chairpersons of the different committees would request studies. I was in a program that dealt with food and agriculture, and I learned quite a bit because of that experience. And from there, I worked for a congressman for a year. And from there, I moved to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in 1979. This is the last year of the Jimmy Carter administration. And there was a lot of hope because Jimmy Carter had put, first of all, solar panels on the White House. And he spoke differently than other presidents.
He didn't just speak slower than most. He spoke differently about different subjects,
yes,
and especially human rights, I remember.
Yeah, because his farming background, he brought a new perspective about what we should do to protect ourselves from unwanted toxins and all sorts of environmental insults from the industry. So I was very happy joining a new organization, and because of the experience I had already published a book about Colombia and the U.S. comparing agriculture in Colombia and the United States. And that book remade my life. And let me spend a few minutes talking about that. The title of the book is called Fear in the Countryside. Now, the title itself tells you that something was fearful, and it did. Part of my postdoctoral was to go to Bogota, Colombia, and joined by a person from the Ford Foundation. And this person, who was an agronomist, he drove me all over Colombia, practically. So I had a chance to see how Colombians raise their food. And I had to make mental comparisons with what we do in the United States. And as part of that journey or trip or research, was to visit an international center for agricultural development they had in Cali, Colombia. And I went there, and the scientists were very kind. They treated me like a professor. So they saw me around and they talked to me, and I kept asking them questions. What do you do? Why are you in Cali, Colombia? What's the point? They showed me the experimental plots they had there with corn and other crops. And they said they were trying to teach Colombians how to raise food. I said, teach Colombians how to raise food? That I found very strange because Colombia and other traditional societies had never had any trouble in raising food. The trouble sometimes comes because of lack of land. If all the land that exists is concentrated into very few hands, and therefore everybody else becomes like a servant or a serf. And I knew all that because I studied, as I said before, I studied medieval Greek history and European history, and I knew a little bit about what had happened to England, what had happened in Russia, France, I knew a little bit about the French Revolution. Therefore, I could ask the proper political questions. One of the questions I asked at the center, I said, since you're doing all this wonderful work, tell me, who are you influencing? I said, you must be influencing the local peasants of Colombia. And he said, absolutely. I said, okay, thank you. And I left with my friend, the Colombian agronomist who was driving me around. And I said to him, let's just test this, what we just learned. Let's go unannounced and knock at people's doors in a rural area next to the international center. And that's exactly what we did for a few days. And my dismay, after about a week of talking to different peasants through my colleague, the Colombian agronomist, we discovered that most of them had not even heard of the center that was located right in their midst.
They could walk to it.
That's right, yeah. And they had never heard of it. That means they didn't receive any assistance or advice or anything like that. Plus, I interviewed politicians in Bogota, Colombia. I interviewed professors. And with all that knowledge, I returned back to the United States and I went to Cambridge where I was doing my research at Harvard. And I threw away the manuscript I had already written and rewrote my manuscript. And that became my first book, Fear in the Countryside. And the title of the word fear is that because I sensed the fear when I was talking to peasants and politicians in Colombia. Colombia was already involved in a civil war, and there were regions of the country that were forbidden. They told us not to visit, not to go. So that book, in a sense, confirmed what I had already learned while growing up in a Greek village in a Greek island. My father was a small peasant and a small farmer. We raised everything. We were self-sufficient in food. And we never, of course, had even heard the word pesticide, much less used them. We didn't have tractors. We had a mule and a plow, a wooden plow, that I remember. I have a picture in my mind. That plow looked exactly like the plows the ancient Greeks used 2,000 years before our Common Era. In other words, in agriculture, the traditional knowledge and technology had not changed for close to 2,000 years. And suddenly, coming to the United States, you've seen all these dramatic changes, big tractors, big machines, harvesting machines, scientists teaching about this and that, and especially being at the University of Illinois, which was an agricultural school, that stayed with me. So this is the background that brought me to EPA. So once at EPA, with all this background, I said, oh my God, I'm going to try to help and see what I can do. And I was even then, to some degree, a little bit of a good writer. So they put me in a position that I was going to be the speech writer for the deputy director of the division and a program analyst, which meant I was a generalist. That means they would bring to me questions that dealt with economics, with history, with politics, and I would try to advise. That was my position. In that division, we had a branch of economics, a branch of biologists, and I was involved with them, and I was going to their meetings and see how the discussion was taking place. All sorts of acronyms. You couldn't really understand sometimes what they were actually trying to say. And usually, scientists are very careful when they put things down in writing in a piece of paper. They're very careful because the answer to a question is not just 1 + 1 = 2. The questions they face with growing food, they are very complicated, and they could be yes, it could be a little bit no. The answers were not straightforward. So I learned to understand and to communicate with this kind of language with my colleagues. But then there was also hundreds of opportunities where I was at meetings with industry representatives that were coming to EPA to request ABCD. That is, they had petitions for the approval of their chemicals, let's say, since we were in a department that dealt with regulation of pesticides. So I had the opportunity to see close in, so become an insider in what was the discussion and why these gentlemen representing big companies, whether it's Monsanto, big corporations, and they were coming there well-dressed, and they were bringing their slide, they were giving slideshows to us, and the EPA scientists were sitting like students learning from the big masters.
And Monsanto is the biggest of the big.
Exactly, yes.
I understand they basically dominate corn growing. They have a type of seed that grows very productively, but it doesn't make more, so you have to buy more.
Yeah, this is the genetic engineering of this discussion. So learning about all this political maneuvering and the favors that these guys were asking EPA people to do, and also observing how the decision was made. So let's assume that we had a chemical, let's say something about DDT, for instance. DDT was big and it was used for practically everything, to kill mosquitoes, to kill any kind of insect. I remember Rachel Carson. I never met her, but Rachel Carson was a woman biologist who wrote a great book, Silent Spring, in 1962. And unfortunately, she died in 1964 from breast cancer. And in that book, she talked about the impact of this chemical on birds in particular, the cell of the
But you're talking about DDT.
DDT. I'm talking about DDT. The impact of the DDT was dramatic in the sense making it almost impossible for the bird to procreate because the bird was laying eggs and then the mother bird or the father bird was on the eggs and the eggs would crush. They were not solid enough. So EPA finally banned DDT in 1972. But all this background, this experience also led me to learn something about laboratories. That is, who was doing the studies? After all, the EPA was asking the person who was coming, the company that was coming to request for the approval of a chemical, they wanted to know something about the toxicology of the material. They wanted to know the effects, the potential hazardous effects on birds, on honeybees, on human health. So who was doing all the studies? And to my regret, to my sadness, I discovered that EPA, instead of having a laboratory independent of these companies to do the studies, they were asking the companies themselves to do their own studies and come up with a report to support their own findings.
So you don't think there was a little bit of coloring the answers?
Yes, indeed. In fact, I had a colleague, his name, he passed away, Adrian Gross. This man was a terrific toxicologist. He had come from Israel. He had got his PhD in Canada. He got to the United States. He was working for the Federal Drug Administration. And in 1976, accidentally, he discovered the largest fraud in the regulation of pesticides in U.S. history. He went to a laboratory outside of Chicago called International Biotest Laboratory. And in speaking to the people in the laboratory about the data they kept from the studies they were doing, he noticed that one of the researchers in the laboratory came with the answers that he was asking on a piece of paper, very nicely written, no problems at all. And Adrian, later he was telling me, I was asking this question, I said, Adrian, how did you discover that they were actually doing fraudulent studies? He said, simple. They gave me all my answers, almost not typed, but written on a piece of paper, very clean. He said, I have had enough laboratory experience that I know that when you work in a laboratory, sometimes a drop of water might drop on the paper. You use different pens, different pencils. And because of that suspicion, he said, I left and I came back with a team of inspectors from the Federal Drug Administration.
In other words, it looked fake.
It looked fake, and it was fake. So they went back and they discovered what they call swamp. Rats were running in the floor, and you had people in the laboratory running after the rats with little gases, trying to knock them down. If they discover that a mouse or a rat developed a lymphoma or some other growth, they simply chopped off the growth and they put it in a bottle. Sometimes they replace the animal with a new animal without reporting that they actually replaced the animal. This started the whole process. This was a giant laboratory, and they were testing 40% of all chemicals in the country. And it wasn't just pesticides, it was drugs that people take for their health. The U.S. Army and Navy, they were testing stuff with that laboratory. Other local governments also were testing stuff. It was a real big tragedy and a big fraud. So they ordered them to shut down, and eventually they brought them to trial. They shut the laboratory down in 1983. So they discovered the problem in 1976, and it took 7 years to put it out of business.
In doing this, when was it revealed to the public? And when was this brought before Congress? Was this brought before the Senate or something?
Yeah, there were hearings, in fact, by Senator Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, before he died. So the laboratory was shut down in 1983, but the hearings took place in the 70s. And
Edward Kennedy.
Huh?
Edward Kennedy.
Yeah, exactly, Edward Kennedy. And in this hearing, of course, Adrian Gross was testified, and he was praised by Kennedy. But unfortunately, in the hearings, they heard the testimony, but they didn't proceed to do anything for the matter, like, for instance, forbidding the companies from testing their own products. And by the way, this process continues to this very day. To this very day, if you're a chemical company, you are in a legitimate legal right to test your own chemical and then simply take a report to EPA or to FDA if it's about food, and they will judge from the report whether you're telling the truth. And EPA, now we are talking about late 70s, when they discovered this fraud, this big laboratory, then they began to discover other laboratories were doing similar things. The laboratories do that because the company that comes to you and they pay $100,000 for one test, they want to know that they're going to get a good report so they can actually register the chemical, so they can recoup the money they spent to develop the chemical and make tremendous profits. And they do make tremendous profits.
Tremendous profits.
In fact, I figure that in 10 to 20 years, they make about $20 million profits out of something that will cost them maybe a couple $100,000. So it's a very lucrative market. And they have a monopoly. The farmers, the people who are on used chemicals, eventually they notice they are damaging the soil. The soil that grows the corn, it gets damaged because the chemical, it should not be called pesticide, it should be called biocide. Those chemicals are designed to kill life. Biocide. But they still call them pesticides, as if they are only designed to kill pests. And the name pest, of course, in English has all sorts of connotations. Something has to be nasty to be called pest. So they're not supposed to kill beneficial insects like honeybees, right? No, of course. Honeybees are extremely important because they are pollinating crops. Here in California, for instance, each April, you have about 600,000 acres. I don't know the number. I'm sorry about the number, but a tremendous number of crops in the Central Valley rely on walnut trees, almond trees rely on honeybees to be pollinated. So because there are not enough honeybee keepers in California, they import honeybee people all the way from Florida, from Illinois. They come, they drive for days, and they bring their honey, the hives, and they put them in the trees, and they let the honeybees go and do what they do, they pollinate the flowers. Once I remember when I was teaching at the Humboldt State University in California, I had one of those guys come to my class to talk about what they're doing. And I said to him, when you go to Central Valley and you do take your hives for pollination, how many hives do you bring back? 1/3 less. 1/3 of his honeybees die during the process of pollination. Why would they die? Because the air has been so much inundated with chemicals. They don't spray when they do the pollination, but they have been spraying for so long that the honeybee is such a sensitive insect. They can die from chemicals sometimes in possibly billion, minute amounts only. And some of those chemicals are neurotoxins. That is, they affect the central nervous system and the brain. And they are other carcinogenic, but the neurotoxins are the worst because the honeybee, when it gets exposed to these chemicals, it does not know how to return back to its hive. It gets lost, it freezes to death. And that's what happens. And unfortunately, the chemicals are still in the market. There's some chemical known as neonicotinoids made in Germany, exported to the United States, not used in Germany. The German government said, no, you're not going to use them here because they know how toxic they are. There's a new science that has been growing because of all this crisis in agriculture. And this profession, they're calling themselves agroecology, meaning ecology designed to benefit the farmer, the field. And what they do is you're growing, let's say, I don't know, corn. They make strips in the corn and they put flowers. They put, I think it's a wheat or some other plant that attracts insects, which eat other insects. They call them entomophages. One insect will eat the other insect, predators. So you grow flowers and other plants that attract those insects. And then next door, they see the aphids that do the damage to the crop. And they go next door and they eat them. So you don't need to spray at all. You use the insects to kill the bad insects. And this is what good ecology does. That is, good science helps you to get out of the trap of the chemical.
But the chemical's easy and cheap, and it's effective, right?
Yeah, not only that, but the chemicals enter into the crop that you spray.
That's not necessarily...
It's very bad.
But for the farmer, it's a known cost, right? You know that's going to happen, and it works. But the fact that it gets into the food is a collateral damage in my mind.
It is. It's one of the worst things I have witnessed in my life in the United States. How in a civilized society, with hundreds of thousands of scientists, and I'm talking about biologists, ecologists, zoologists, phytopathologists, you name. They have come to the point to agree that it's okay to poison the food that people eat. Because in a sense, no, I'm using a metaphor. I'm not saying that intentionally they go and poison what you're going to eat. But in a sense, by spraying a crop, the chemical you spray the crop with gets absorbed into the very stuff that you actually eat. Because of all that, in the 90s, they passed a law about organic farming, meaning the federal government passed this law and they said, we have a way we can grow food without poisoning the food. That is, and they use this agroecological knowledge. The law forbids the farmer from using synthetic fertilizers, biocides, meaning chemicals, agricultural chemicals, sludge, and radiation. So the food that you get out of something that's called organic farming is as wholesome as you can imagine.
Now, one more question. Some of the fertilizers come from petroleum, don't they?
Yes, of course. They're all petroleum chemicals. They're petrochemicals.
Right. And so here we are trying to get off of oil.
Yes,
And the first thing we do is turn around and use oil to help grow our food.
exactly. And indeed, agriculture as a whole, and in
It's for
which,
the nitrogen, though, in it, isn't it? Isn't that what they're after?
what do you mean?
When they use oil to make fertilizers and all, is it the nitrogen they're after from the oil or not?
I don't know, but I know that the synthetic fertilizer is made out of petroleum.
There we go. That's enough.
And the pesticides themselves are grown, they are made out of petroleum. They are petrochemicals. And agriculture as a whole contributes to 1/3 to 1/2. Let's be conservative, let's say 1/3 of the total greenhouse gas emissions that are warming the planet. So agriculture is a gigantic component of warming the planet, therefore creating this climate dragon in the room.
So when they spread the fertilizer, the light parts of the oil evaporate into the air. Is that it? Where do the greenhouse gases come from?
The greenhouse gases come, number one, from pesticides, because you use, let's say, a cup of petroleum to create this much amount of chemical which you spray. Now, the petrochemical component of the fertilizer is there, but I don't know the process. I cannot answer your question exactly, how this stuff gets up, but it gets up.
But my main question, is it in refining it to the point that it's a fertilizer or a pesticide, or is it after you spread it onto the field?
It's after you spray it in the field.
Is where the greenhouse gases
Yeah,
come from.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, exactly. And therefore, and of course, if we go to the idea of having concentrated farm operations, that is where you have thousands of chickens or thousands of hogs or cattle, then you create a problem that is much, much worse than what we're talking about. Because in this process of putting, let's say, 100 cows in a tiny little room like this, one next to each other, they create disease. To avoid all the cows dying at the same time, they feed the cows, but then they mix their food with antibiotics, drugs. So when you have a piece of cheeseburger, you eat the meat, you eat the antibiotics, you eat the pesticides, because they feed the animals conventional food, that is conventional corn, conventional soybeans.
And I understand the corn that's fed to the animals is not what you and I buy in the store as sweet corn.
No.
The corn that is fed to the animals is a bit tough. You could possibly eat it, but it's not what we normally have. But they are looking at a field to grow as much beef as they can. And there's some ratio I heard where it takes about seven times the amount of input to grow beef. And I'm talking about water and all the crops.
Yeah, water.
As it does just to grow the plant itself.
Yes, especially, for instance, if you grow almonds.
Oh my God.
There is in the almond, and then the other little crop, or what we call it?
Pistachios?
Pistachio and almonds and
Cashews?
what? Damn it. One of them requires 1 gallon of water per little, and I
Right.
don't remember the name. Damn it, suddenly disappeared from my head. So these crops require a tremendous amount of water. And of course, in this case of California, where the Colorado River is practically drying out, it's problematical to give the farmers 80% of the drinking water of the state. So this is part of the process of industrializing the whole agricultural system. So it runs like a clockwork, like a factory.
But now the farmers have
And
gotten that deal from a long time ago.
yeah, several decades ago. I remember in the 70s that discussion has started. Indeed, I theorized that, not just theorized, but I have published 5 books about agriculture. And I remember doing my original research that when I got to the United States in 1961, there were several million small family farmers in the United States. Today, if you look at the statistics from the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, there are only a few thousand big farmers that grow 90% of what we eat. So there has been a tremendous concentration of power. So that, for instance, states like Iowa, they have only 3 million citizens, people that live in Iowa, but they have probably 30 million pigs and chickens and all this easily. So these animals, they have a lot of excrement, a lot of waste. None of that waste is being treated like the human waste when we dump the stuff.
But it's not put just right back into the ground, is it?
Some of it is spraying on land, but you have too much of it. So eventually when it rains, where do you think it goes? Into the rivers. So in the state of North Carolina, for instance, I remember there was kind of a gigantic storm with a tremendous amount of rain, and some of these lagoons, they have lagoons that they keep all this excrement, it were overflown and they went into the river, and of course it killed all fish, all life in the whole river. So we are dealing with tremendous amount of impact, adverse effects on fish, on the birds, on honeybees, on the beautiful wildlife that we rely for our own existence. The ecologists call it ecosystem services, that we have clean water and we have whatever we need to survive. That ecosystem gets wrecked by this kind of system where agriculture, where you have only one corn that covers, let's say, 5,000 acres or 10,000 acres, nothing in between, all the same corn. So let's assume that you're a honeybee or you're a bird, and you look down and you see all this strange one color. What would you do for food? Where would you go to find an insect? When that crop has been sprayed, they have killed all insects, all living creatures.
Everything.
Everything is there.
Worms, snakes, gophers.
Yeah, everything. So to me, that's completely unconscionable that we are doing so much damage to our land, and therefore we undermine the future of our children and grandchildren.
Now, my friends told me that you can spot a Monsanto field of corn if anybody on the planet, as soon as they know what to look for, if you're driving down the country road, what have you, right? And you look to the left and you look to the right, the Monsanto cornfield, every corn plant will look almost exactly like the next one.
Yeah.
It's like they just got manufactured and boom, another one, boom. And if you look at the natural corn field, they're all different and they maybe don't have as much corn, but you can, just by looking left and right, you can tell. And I understand that some of the plants have been engineered to repel the pests just by their very nature. Is that right?
Yes, I remember in the 90s, this is during the Clinton administration, another Democrat, good boy. Clinton administration, we created a new division at the EPA, about 90 people working on nothing else except genetic engineering of crops. So they were assistant farmers and the companies that were doing the actual genetic engineering to do it properly. And I remember talking to them and, of course, reading extensively about the process of genetic engineering. What they do is they take genes out of one species and they shoot it into another species. They can take genes out of a fish and shoot it into the plant that we know as corn. And of course, the Federal Drug Administration, to facilitate this process, to make it easier for the genetic engineering companies to do what they do, they said, look, the genetic engineering of crops is not different than the crops that have not been genetically engineered. Of course, this is wrong. Because the whole plant, when you shoot genes of one species into another, you change the makeup of the other species. And therefore, you cannot say that they're identical, but yet that's exactly what they do in order to avoid been sued for libel, for all sorts of things. And therefore, the homogeneity that you spoke about, that is the identical visual look of a corn, is primarily because of this genetic engineering of corn.
But they just replicate.
Yeah, and then the problem with the genetic engineering is that they're not safe. They're not really safe for you, because first of all, you don't know what you're eating, and then they also have insecticides in the corn itself. In other words, when you get the seed of corn that is from a genetic engineering,
Which the Monsanto controls. You don't get the seed from the corn itself in the field. The Monsanto folks, no, you have to buy their stuff the next
yeah,
day.
yeah, but that seed has the identical information that the genetic engineering corn has. And therefore, from the very beginning, you put the seed into the soil and begins to grow like a plant. The whole plant is toxic. That is designed to kill any insect that bites it.
Engineered into the plant itself.
Yeah.
To make it pest resistant.
Yeah, in other words, they make the plants themselves pesticides. I mean, I'm using metaphor now, so that an insect like a honeybee, it will be dead within a second, because the insect thinks
It's
that
a regular plant.
she's going to a regular plant, but no, she's not in a regular plant. That regular plant is not regular anymore. It produces toxins to kill any insect biting it or sucking the juice that they have. So to me, it's another abnormal development that gain fashion because of the money and because of the easiness within which you can use to concentrate power again.
So now the EPA, though, is in charge of regulating the degree, if not the absolute amount that they can do of that. Is that correct?
Yes, there is a law and they have regulations and they are supposed to do all that. And, while I spent 25 years of my life within the agency, I'm not about to say that it's useless, but what I'm ready to say is that the EPA was the best political idea this country has ever had in the 20th century. And it came under a Republican president, Mr. Nixon, who was fighting a war in Vietnam. At the same time, he had advisors who were wise enough to urge him to sign off or create an EPA, because the country had serious ecological problems. There was a river in Ohio that was catching fire. So we did not know about the water we were drinking, the milk we were eating, what was in it. So the EPA came in 1970, December 1970, and it did a lot of good in the first few years of its life. For instance, it banned DDT in 1972. It banned a number of other DDT-like chemicals. DDT, not only, as I said, causes a lot of damage, but it lasts in the environment for decades. They got rid of a lot of those chemicals, but then eventually the industry fought back. And they said, look, this is dangerous. So they spoke to the congressmen and senators, of course, and they have these lobbyists. Washington is full of lobbyists, and these people are very well paid, and they are designed to take you to lunch, to take you to dinner if you are an official of the government, and to write speeches for you, to propose legislation. And indeed, the whole Pesticides Act that is still in existence today was drafted by polluters, by these people. And when they do a revision of a law, the lobbyists are right there with their lawyers. And they are urging and they are advising the people from the EPA, and they work together. Indeed, they have conferences that they go together. I was invited to go to some of these conferences. I never went to, because I knew what was going on. They would take you all the way to Florida in a beautiful hotel. They feed you for 2 days, have dancing and music and so on. But the process is to get you together, to get the regulators and the regulated.
And in itself, there isn't anything really wrong with that.
No.
Except when the EPA folks are compromised.
Yeah, they are compromised because they know they're intelligent people. They have doctor's degrees in all the sciences, and they have seen, as I did, that their work sometimes is completely dismissed. It's like a lipstick. I have 10 toxicologists that have done this, and here are their reports, but I make the decisions. And who appointed me? The president appointed me. So I look at your report and say, thank you very much, Dr. So-and-so, but I will make a different decision. In other words, I will go ahead and approve this chemical despite the fact you wrote a memorandum telling me that if I approve the chemical, it will continue to kill honeybees.
So let me draw a parallel. I used to work in an industry that made dynamometers that would be used for testing vehicles. All the major vehicle manufacturers had to buy one of these so that when they did the tests on their cars, it was the same exact test as the EPA was going to do on the car. So they didn't submit the car for testing until they knew it was going to pass. No, but that's okay.
No, I'm
It's
not.
like they did their homework. They tuned it properly,
Sure.
whatever it is. Because as you said, the testing at the agency is not cheap,
No.
but they want to make sure they pass. They would submit the vehicle and then the EPA would test it on their own in their own smog lab and blah,
Yes.
blah, blah.
Uh-huh.
And I always thought that was fair. Do your best, but make sure it passes the test and then give it to them and see how it does. Your example is different. They don't really do an honest test, and the EPA doesn't really do any of their own either.
That's quite true. Not only that, but in the 70s and early 80s, especially during the Reagan administration, they began to shut down their own laboratories. The EPA
Right.
had its own laboratories. There was a laboratory, for instance, in Sumter down in Tennessee, that was the best in the country in terms of detecting dioxin. Dioxin is a synthetic chemical that nobody produces it, but it's part of the process of producing certain chemicals. And that part, however, remains with the chemical that you create. You remember during the Vietnam War, they used something, they call it Agent Orange.
Right.
That was a combination of two chemicals, 2,4,5-T and 2,4-D. You put them together 50-50, but those two chemicals are, how to put it, are contaminated with this dioxin, what they call tetrapezo. Anyway, it's a dioxin. And that chemical is so toxic that it can be lethal in the past per trillion. And they don't know what to do. They did not know what to do unless they changed the process of creating something to get rid of it. Because nobody creates dioxin, but dioxin comes as part of creating something else. And I understand the problem. It was extremely difficult. Scientific problem, how to get rid of this stuff while you create other material. But that chemical was probably gave the cancer to most of the people that were sprayed by this Agent Orange, and especially the American soldiers in Vietnam that were loading and unloading the stuff on the airplanes.
Or under the airplanes when they're...
Or under the airplanes, that's right. In fact, in Alexandria, Virginia, I had a neighbor for about 10 years. And the man, I got to know him. We used to walk the dogs together. And he was telling me the stories from the Vietnam War. And I did ask him, I said, hey, what were you doing? I said, I know you were a soldier, but what? Oh, he said I was part of the crew that we were spraying the Agent Orange. He died. He died exactly from the same cancer that most of the other people that had been exposed to that chemical.
And now that, if I'm not mistaken, that's one of DuPont's products.
Yes, exactly.
One time I was looking to buy some adhesives from DuPont, and I asked him, I said, oh, weren't you the guys that gave us Agent Orange? And the guy was like, yes, but that was a while ago, a different division. He was, but apparently everybody knows and continues to associate that name with Agent Orange and the maladies that you speak of. So my question is, with the EPA, I read an article in the Wall Street Journal recently that Biden wants to rebuild the EPA. Over the years, the EPA has been gutted. I mean, tell me what I'm wrong. They closed their labs. They don't have as many people. They don't have as much resources as they need. And whether you're like Joe Biden or not, one of the things he wants to do is to rebuild it back to a point where it's useful. The amount of money that's going to take is going to be the hardest thing for him to get. What would you say? There's other agencies that are just like that, where, for instance, the FAA was having Boeing do all the tests on the airplanes and just give them the results. They weren't actually testing the airplanes.
Same thing, yeah.
And look what happens. I think the landscape is littered with these kind of examples where the government agency that's supposed to be watching really isn't, because they can't, like the SEC. Now we have banks closing all over the place.
Yeah.
And my question is, like, Where were the regulators? How could we get to this point? One bank goes down. Okay, I get it. 2, 3, others have to come in. Who was watching? So my question to you is that for the EPA, let's focus on that. The amount of money that would be spent on rebuilding the EPA, do you think that would save America, the population, afterwards more in terms of lower medical costs, longer life? This is an investment that needs to be made just for people's well-being. Is that fair?
Of course, it's fair. Not only it's fair, but it's necessary not only to preserve human health. You don't want to eat poison in your food. But then we also have the natural world. We don't want to see all the fish dead, all the birds dead, because we'll be next. So the Environmental Protection Agency, the law is designed to protect human beings and the environment. So we are talking about ecological health and human health. I have thought about it and I have written about it. And by the way, this is the book that describes all my experience within EPA, the Poison Spring.
That's available on Amazon?
Yeah, it's available in big bookstores, the Amazon, and so on.
But what I like about that book is it's also available as an audiobook, right?
Yes. Yes.
So when I drive back and forth to work in my car, I don't have to read it. I can just listen.
Yes, exactly. So I have thought about it and what I would do if I were president, if I had the money. First of all, you have to cut off the connection between the EPA and the industry. In other words, you have to tell the industry, I know what you're trying to do and we thank you, but you're not going to be allowed to go and lobby the EPA scientists themselves.
You need to get out of the building.
Exactly. Never approach the building. Don't go in. Send official communications. You're going to have communications department, and you can express yourself in writing what you want, and we're going to respond. But we don't want you to go and try to convince the EPA scientists that you need a favor or whatever. And if you do that,
in other words, quid pro quo has to stop.
Yeah. And not only that, but I would also say that the EPA needs its own laboratories to do the testing. That is, if you want to test a chemical, you're not going to be allowed to do your own testing of the chemical. You're going to bring to the government, pay the amount of money that you would pay a private company to do the testing, and we're going to test it for you.
And just like the vehicles, the companies have the right and really should do all the testing on their own so that when they submit the chemical to the EPA for testing, they're pretty sure of what the results are going to be.
Oh, yeah. They can do that, but not to do what they did with the EPA case with the chemical.
They shouldn't be doing it instead. They should be doing it also.
Also, exactly. Yeah.
So to hand a new chemical to the EPA and say, hey, look, we know how this works right down to the last molecule.
Yeah.
You test it. And if the results are the same, then okay.
Perfect.
Then maybe you have a viable product, but not where the EPA just says, well, if you tested it, then it's probably good.
And then I would also put a lot of my effort into ecology, that is into the agroecology, so that you can begin to train the farmers through USDA. They have this extension service. Retrain the extension service to begin to provide correct information to the farmer and tell him, Mr. Brown, instead of using neonicotinoids to kill all your honeybees, why don't you follow this process that we know it's effective? You're not going to spend money for chemicals, but you're going to get a good crop. And we guarantee you're going to get a good crop if you follow these instructions. So you need to re-educate a little bit the farmers.
So then let me ask you about that. One of the pushbacks on organic food, like for instance, that you see at the store, the regular grocery store, is that it's usually more expensive.
Slightly more expensive?
Slightly more expensive. And,
yes.
And not enough to bankrupt anybody, but enough where it's like, what's the difference?
Exactly.
And I think that at this point, can you speak to what is the difference? Why is it worth, say, 10 cents more a pound or something like that?
The difference is that once you eat wholesome food, once you eat an orange that has been certified organic, you are eating a substance of something that is really good for you, and there is no chemical in the fruit that you eat that will actually harm your liver or harm your brain if it's a neurotoxin, or maybe give you cancer. So these are the tremendous advantages. And especially if you have children, you don't want to feed those children food that has been contaminated by chemicals. And these are extremely toxic chemicals. They're very, very, very powerful. And especially the neurotoxins.
They accumulate in your body. They don't just come and go.
Exactly.
Alcohol, okay, and you drink, and then a day or so later, it's no trace.
Yeah, you're right.
Whereas these chemicals don't always leave.
Yeah, and if they are neurotoxins, you can imagine they affect your brain. Therefore, they're affecting the ability of you to learn. If you're a growing child and you go to school, your ability to think, to make rational decisions, because these are affecting the nerves of the body, your brain. And then we should be alert because in this country, regrettably, we have so many people that commit murders for nothing. They go and kill children. They go to a shopping mall and they begin to shoot at random. These are not acts of reasonable human beings who think rationally. There's something wrong with their brain, something wrong.
So do you believe there's a correlation between the amount of neurotoxins that are residual and maybe build up in people and behavior like that?
I would think that I'm not a medical doctor, but I would say yes. Yeah, one of my greatest complaints is the medical community. Medical doctors should demand when they ask a person to go and have a blood test, the chemicals they are trying to discover have nothing to do with agricultural chemicals. In fact, I asked my own personal physician last year when I went for an examination, and he said, now you got to go to this medical laboratory, you're going to test this. I said, what about pesticides? He looked at me, he said, what, pesticides? I said, yes, pesticides. I said, I don't think I have any pesticides because I eat organic food. But what about you? I said, do you eat organic food?
And do you test for it?
Yeah.
When you go to get a new job, the first thing they test you for is this kind of drug, that kind of drug, this other kind of drug that would affect your performance at the job.
Exactly.
So you're saying that if they would also test you for pesticides so you don't die, which really inhibits your performance at the job, that might be a good thing.
But if all doctors did exactly what I'm suggesting, that is to request the testing of everybody for pesticides, all that data would come to the surface. Newspapers would begin to write about children being tested, and suddenly they find neurotoxins in their bloodstream. In the early 70s, I remember reading a report about EPA itself. In 1971, there was a guy from EPA, toxicologist, who testified in Congress that he found chemicals, pesticides in women's breast milk. Mm-hmm. Imagine now the breast milk. Suppose this woman was married and she had a child, and the child was
breastfeed.
Yeah. What would the baby eat?
So they pass chemicals on that way, even as it is. Breastfeeding will pass on the results of like cocaine addiction. Breastfeeding will pass on marijuana, pass on other, because where's it coming from? From the body, where all the poisons are.
Exactly.
If you take this to its logical extension, then they might as well eat paint chips. But I'm just saying that if you're going to protect your baby from one thing, why not protect it from all things?
If I were the government again, I would not only support organic farming and try to expand it dramatically, because the more you would produce, the less the price would drop to practically identical with the non-organic food. And convince...
So volume on organic food would solve the price issue?
Maybe. That's what they say. I'm not an economist. But they say the more you produce, the cheaper you will get per pound to buy whatever it is. And I would try to convince the farmers who have been hooked on these chemicals, because you do get hooked on these chemicals. I mean, you're hooked not in a sense of smoking, but in a sense of knowing that if you spray this chemical and that chemical, you're going to get X amount of wheat, X amount of oranges, or whatever. And you don't think about the adverse effects you have on the soil, or the effects you have on the stuff when it rains, or the stuff gets into the river, killing of the fish, and so on. And in the soil itself, by the way, there are bacteria. Some of them are very good bacteria for us, but some of them are pretty bad. And what does the chemical do? It kills the good bacteria, and therefore you have a proliferation of the bad bacteria, and you get very little nutrition in the actual stuff that you eat. So you may have wheat, but the wheat might be empty of the stuff that is really good for you.
So, in other words, your Wheaties might as well be made out of cardboard.
Something close to that, yeah. And so there are tremendous philosophical, scientific, and political ideas related to how we grow food and why we do what we do. And this is why I just told you, when I was from a small family farm. I got all this education, and I went to Colombia. I wrote this first book about agriculture, and then I went into the EPA, and I was astonished. I loved the agency. I was so enthusiastic to work and do whatever I could to help. And suddenly I discovered all this abnormal stuff. I tried to be diplomatic, but I couldn't. I had to raise my hand and ask questions, or when we had meetings, And because of that, the people that supervise my work, they began to say I'm not a good team player. And therefore, you know what the implication of that is, that they won't promote you if they say something like this. So it took years for me to be promoted, and I was promoted by accident. We had an acting division director. The division director that I had for several years hated me, so I would never be promoted. So something happened to him and he left. A woman came as an acting division director. She discovered about my education. She said, my God, why are you still 13? No, just 12? I said, yeah. And I explained. I said, oh my God. So she promoted me. With 2 weeks, I was just 13. That was it. 25 years. And I mean, I don't want to spend time talking about petty kind of vengeance and other things, but nevertheless, the people who try to do what is morally correct and for the good for the country, they do pay a price, a tremendous price. If I had done the confessional stuff as most people do, I would have retired on probably another $50,000 per year more. But I didn't. I stood my ground because everything I wrote down on memoranda was very well documented. I was interviewing scientists. I was reading the literature, cited with footnotes, everything I said. And I didn't go anywhere. They thought I was foolish to do that sort of thing. And I said to myself, look, you only have one life to live. And I don't want to end up this for a pittance of money or even big money, so how am I going to look back at my children or my grandchildren when they ask the question, hey, what did you do when you were actually working?
And if the answer is, I lied my ass off,
yeah,
then that's not really a nice legacy to leave your kids.
Exactly, yeah. So for that reason, I pay the price, but I think it's worth paying that price. But what I'm trying to say now, if Biden is serious, he wants to reorganize and create a good EPA, he has to think about all these implications. People who go to work for EPA, they are very well-educated people and very well-meaning because they have chosen some agency that says Environmental Protection Agency. What is the environment? The environment is the natural world. We are part of that natural world. We are one species out of millions. And we dominate nature to the point we crush nature. And in my tradition, in the Greek tradition, the natural world was worshipped. The Greeks thought the earth was a goddess. And some of that has remained with me, and I'm glad it has. And I think we should change it. So if I was the president, I would have my own laboratory, the EPA. I would hire people and tell them you're going to come here and do an honest work, and we want to use your ethical standards to do this work. And we're going to tell the industry, you stay where you are, you test your chemical, but we're going to also test the chemical. And we don't want you to come and lobby the EPA people at all. And if possible, to create an institution like Elizabeth Warren, the senator from Massachusetts, had created a small place, something about money, the Economics Bureau, I don't know, remember the name, but that institute got its money directly from the Treasury rather than from the Office of the Management and Budget. Therefore, it could not be affected by Congressman X calling and wanting to punish the EPA because they did this.
They're independent.
Yeah, this is exactly what we need to do. If we're serious about our health and the health of the natural world, we have to create a politically and a scientifically independent agency. And by the way, in that process, the president should not have the right to appoint the director of the EPA. Why? Because the president has all sorts of advisors.
And agendas.
An agenda saying he wants to do this and that.
So you think it should be appointed by what? The Supreme Court?
He should be, the director of the EPA should be elected and be given 10 years, and that's it. No.
One term, the end.
One term from 5 to 10 years, they decide, and you can never apply for a job again to the EPA. That's it. So that would also mean you shut down the revolving door. The revolving door means chemical industry guys come and work for EPA, and EPA people work for the industry.
What I've seen in other things, like for instance, one company I worked for used to sell to the military, and they would have somebody from the Army, say, come out and observe tests and make sure that they were getting what we promised, right? But in talking to some of these gentlemen, they said that their big goal was, as soon as they got out of the military, they wanted to go work for the manufacturers of this kind of equipment to help them navigate what can be a convoluted path to get a product approved. But again, their idea then is to curry favor with the manufacturers, not say no. So when they do get out, they can go there for a job. Do you think that the EPA then, if you work for the EPA, you should be compensated to a level that going to work for a similar job outside the EPA is not only, maybe not even allowed, that might be a contract you'd sign on the way in, but not even to your advantage. It's, no, I don't want to leave. Those are terrible jobs. I make more here than I could possibly make on some outside contractor. Would that then tend to influence more honesty?
I think so. If you know from the very beginning you start your employment and you have signed a contract that says that if you decide to stay here, you don't have the right to actually join any organization in the private industry that is trying to sell the products that we regulate. You can work for a non-profit organization, you can go to a university, you can do anything you damn please, but do not pretend you're going to go and work for the industry that we regulate, because that's where the conflict of interest immediately comes.
And even if not at the moment, in the future.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, that is what is basically debasing the agency.
I see that also, for instance, in the Securities and Exchange Commission. I see that in being part of the prosecutor's office. You see it in movies all the time.
Yes.
Is that the idea of working for the government agency is to get the job, let's say maybe right out of school or soon after, get some experience, and then go make big money at the hedge fund or big money at the law office or something like that. And that would be the same kind of restriction. Let's put a cap on this, because you've talked about if you were president. Okay. And while I would vote for you, it's expensive, right?
Very expensive and unlikely that they will ever.
Well, you couldn't actually be, you weren't born here.
20 years ago. Oh, yeah, that's right. I was not born in this country, so forget it.
So that's a killer rule right there.
Exactly.
All right, so you're off the hook, right? Let's suppose, since this is Claremont Speaks, what would you do here in Claremont if it was up to you? In other words, if you were put as the Claremont czar of good food here in Claremont, what would you do?
I would start with the farmer's market, for instance. The farmer's market has maybe 10 to 20 different people that sell food. And I noticed that no more than one or two of them have certified organic. I would forbid any farmer, any person selling food who is not certified organic to come to Claremont to sell food. Why would I do that? Because of the reasons we already talked about. We want to sell the people of Claremont clean, wholesome food. And number two, I would try to get the city to promote, maybe even fund small organizations to begin to move in that direction. That is to promote ecological knowledge at the elementary school level, at the high school level, and at the colleges that we have here. 5 colleges. Do they teach ecological issues?
They don't even serve organic food in their own cafeterias.
Yeah. That's what I discovered at Pomona College when I was giving a talk, and I asked the students, what kind of food do you eat? And they looked at me like I was from another planet. I said, do you have organic food at least? And the student said, maybe the salad is organic, something like that. Maybe.
Right.
Yeah.
The French fries, maybe not.
Yeah. So get the colleges to promote and to use and to buy organic food. And the more we buy organic food, of course, the more people will actually grow organic food. And that's the...
And these kind of things affect kids way more than they do adults.
Of course.
And it's simply, if nothing else, it's a matter of mass ratios. In other words, a 50-pound kid eating something, it doesn't dilute as much as a 200-pound adult. We'll just put it that way. It's 4 to 1, right? So would you say, for instance, school lunches?
Yeah, absolutely. It's perfect. It's a perfect example. Thank you. Yeah.
At the high school, or having education for the parents for school lunches. I see the little kids getting dropped off for school, and they got their backpacks, and they got 300 pounds worth of books for a 50-pound kid, but they probably are taking their lunch. Would there be some education and encouragement for the parents to say, hey, look, we'd like to keep the neurotoxins to a minimum so they can learn better? Is that fair?
Yes, absolutely. Not only the schools should be having this kind of education, but the city should find a way to spread this literacy. It's ecological literacy. And I was thinking about climate change. They could do the same thing to promote ecological literacy among the people who drive cars. The people who drive cars, do they know what comes out of their car? I rather doubt it. Many of them don't, and they don't care. And I can see them, they go there. Sometimes they turn off the engine, they turn on the engine, and they begin to read. In fact, I got so furious once I saw a woman doing that, and I knocked at the window. I said, can I please talk to you? She turns around. I said, why are you here with the engine on?
So she can run the AC.
Yeah. I said, she was reading.
I know, but you want to keep cool while she's there.
Yeah,
And that
yeah.
is the least efficient way to get air conditioning.
Yeah. And I said to her, do you know what comes out of your car? She looked at me,
Like, get away from me.
up the window, zoom. She left immediately.
So then one of the things that I think Claremont prides itself on, and there's a group in Claremont called Sustainable Claremont.
Oh, yes.
One of the things that makes it sustainable is if you grow, use, and you're not always looking to add more from outside. In other words, it regenerates. Isn't that about the fundamental definition?
Sustainability means that you want to preserve something that you have. Now, of course, you don't want to preserve nuclear weapons, but you want to preserve
I don't want to
good
use them
health.
either, right?
Yeah, exactly. You have to know that you have something that is good for you, good for the society that you live in. And then, of course, you want to sustain it, to maintain, to keep it, and to repeat and use it.
Yeah,
But it has to be good.
But it also has to self-generate. It helps generate itself. Now, we have a number of grocery stores in the area. One I like is south of the freeway, and they just seem to have the best produce. And there's others that pride themselves on that too. Whole Foods, if you have the scratch for it, I think that's not bad. Or some of the others. Would you encourage? It's hard to regulate or make them do anything legally, but would you make it to their best advantage to have, for instance, a certified organic section? Because you go in, okay, organic bananas, okay, and a few things, but it's not like everything they have has a choice.
Of course not.
Now, as being the EPA czar of Claremont, how would you then promote the stores to participate in that? Because if the mothers are making lunches for their kids, they have to get certified pesticide, neurotoxin-free stuff. How would you go about having the stores participate in that movement?
I would try to find one or two members of the city council, and together we would go and meet with the head of each of the stores. Or together, maybe the mayor or one member of the city council can invite all the heads of these grocery stores to come for a meeting and have a discussion.
So if it's Vaughn's or Sprouts or whoever it is.
Yeah, exactly.
Just to have a little forum and say, hey, look, we think we can do better.
Yeah, absolutely. And it will be good for them. They will make even more money by having more organic food. And they themselves will begin a campaign of literacy to inform whoever has the money, whoever has the power, to promote a kind of agriculture, to promote a kind of food that they actually sell, and be proud of it, and put big labels to say, hey, we are selling organic food, and define what's organic food so people can understand. I'm not going to have food that has neurotoxins.
And every other poison you can think of. And so maybe you don't do all the work. Maybe our listeners do participate. How would they go about it?
Meaning the listeners.
The listeners, because I want to ask you, we're gonna cap it with this.
Yeah.
Two things. First of all, what would you like the listeners to do as a result of your talk here today?
Yeah. I would like them, when they go to a restaurant, to request organic food. When they go to a grocery store, to buy certified organic food. And then to write letters to the city council to begin a campaign of convincing the schools to offer organic lunch for the students.
At least an option.
An option, yes.
It's up to the people. It's free will.
Yeah, exactly.
But if they offer the option and it becomes so overwhelmingly popular, all the better.
Yeah. And then also to see that we invite organic farmers at the farmers market every Sunday. So they themselves have a chance to spread the good news and to also sell good food for people who go and buy food every Sunday.
So you might even change the name of the farmers market to the organic farmers market.
Yeah, I think it should be that way, yes.
Just define it right up front and say, hey, look, that's what we're about. That's what you would do.
Yeah, that's exactly what I would do.
There's nothing wrong with the farmers there themselves, but if you would say the listeners might go to somebody selling carrots and say, oh, I'd buy these if they were certified organic.
Exactly.
And not if they aren't. And I think pretty soon the farmers, and because they are, all the farmers there at the farmers market are not farmers in Claremont.
No, they're not.
But be that as it may, they can come from the moon. I don't care.
Exactly.
But the point being is that if the people that are listening would say, it's not so hard, just bring organic stuff and we'll continue to buy your stuff.
Exactly.
That would be a suggestion?
Absolutely. Yeah, this city deserves better, and it has the ability, and it has the means, and it has the money, they can eat organic food, which is good for them, good for the environment, and good for the whole country. Because one good brings to another good. The other, you begin to think about how to preserve the earth, how to preserve the land. And then you think about climate change and the connections between farming and climate change.
I've long thought and suggested to the city council members that Claremont should endeavor to set itself above the cities around us as an example of what can be aspired to.
Yeah,
In other words, the same thing should go with everything. It's look, do you want a walkable city? Make one.
make it one.
You know,
With bicycles?
yeah. Like, do you want to have affordable housing? Figure it out. Just don't talk about it. And they're trying, and I get it. It's not so easy. You want to have a sustainable environment here? Do something, and then make it such that others look at Claremont and go like, well, it is possible. Oh, it can be done. Oh,
Exactly.
we should do that too, and lead by example. You agree?
This is exactly what we talked about last time we talked about solar panels. The idea was to make Clermont a paradigmatic city. Other cities would look at what the Clermont does and they would follow suit. And that good example follows, and it could be all over California. But we need to be an example.
With organic food, it just isn't that difficult. It's not like
No,
changing everything to electric cars tomorrow, but you can change what you buy at the grocery store this week.
it's good, and especially to start teaching the children from elementary school up and on that they should aspire to create something good for them and to maintain that tradition. Agriculture is a civilization on its own. And it used to be, and it can still be, if we, the people who eat food, respect the land and we try to support farmers or ourselves growing food, but in a sustainable manner. That means a way that we don't hurt. The land is full of life. We don't want to damage life in order for us to be who we are. The birds are important. The honeybees are terribly important. All the diversity we need has to be, because without the biological diversity, we are going to be one of the species that eventually will have to disappear. We cannot survive alone.
It'll
It's
be
impossible.
suicide.
Yeah.
So I'm going to call that the main takeaway. What you just said would be the number one thing I think you'd like people to remember from this talk. Is that fair?
Yes.
All right. So is there anything else you'd like to say to cap this off?
I want to say that EPA is a fantastic opportunity to come back to life, but to come back to life as an independent agency protecting all people, protecting the whole natural world. And we need to make it independent so it avoids any corruption, and it can become example for the rest of the planet. Because believe me, in Europe, they look at what EPA does and they imitate it. So the more good things EPA does, the better for the planet, the better for us. And EPA, as I said, is a fantastic organization, but needs support. It needs to be an independent
But it
organization.
could much better.
Much better, much better.
If I were to cap this with one thought, is that the U.S., not only the regular consumer, but the government, should endeavor to discourage products from other countries that are, and we'll just limit it to food products at this point, that are not grown in accordance with the best health guidelines.
Exactly. And not
And-
organic.
And the point being is that as a country, we should be able to put the sway that probably only the United States has towards saying, no, you're growing poison. We're going to shop elsewhere. The government officials in concert with the EPA should kind of use the influence the American dollar, the American economy, the American people have to say, hey, look, we're going to do better. And then locally to Claremont, I would say, look, start the ball rolling.
Yeah, absolutely. Agriculture, as I said, is a civilization. And in this country, we could create millions of more jobs if we take some of the gigantic estates and split them up in 160 acres. We have all these young people in New York cities, in major cities, who are completely aimless and they are doped and so on. How about training those people, educate them, and give them an opportunity to produce something that is good for themselves, good for their family, and good for all of us? That is another step in that direction of thinking organically, that is thinking of a sustainable way to raise food. Hippocrates, 2,500 years ago, he used to say, food is medicine. And he was right. The food you eat shows in how you look, what you do, how you think.
So the phrase you are what you eat is really not so far from the truth.
No.
All right. Ev, then I'm going to thank you for coming on Claremont Speaks again. And I wanted to ask one last question. What next time are you going to want to talk about?
Next time, since we spoke about EPA, next time maybe I can speak about agriculture in more depth. And in that question, then I would go back into my upbringing and speak a little bit about myself. I don't want to brag or do anything, but I want whoever listens to us understands where this comes from.
Okay.
And we'll take it from there.
Very cool. I just wanted to give people a little peek as to what Claremont Speaks is going to be bringing. We're going to endeavor to bring a much higher order of topic to our listeners. And I think you've done just that this time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Ev, thank you again. And Claremont, thank you for listening. I hope you share this with the world because it isn't just a Claremont thing. And hope you'll be here next time when Claremont Speaks.